One of the most important things for leaders to understand, especially when they're leading people across different geographies, cultures, or countries, is that not every national culture, for the most part, is the same. If you, for example, were born and raised in the United States and suddenly find yourself leading an organization or a group of people in, say, Japan or China or Mexico or Italy, you're likely to run into different cultural differences that are important for leaders to know about beforehand. Of course, it's too simple to say that one culture is completely different from another culture, but over time, especially for those of us who spent time living in other countries and other cultures, you do notice some general tendencies that managers need to be aware of if, like myself, you find yourself managing across different countries and different cultures during part of your leadership careers. So years back, there was a person named Geert Hofstede. Geert Hofstede did a lot of studies to try to summarize how to describe different national cultures and why managers need to understand the differences among these cultures if the manager wants to do a good job leading, motivating, and working with employees in these different cultures. Now, I'll start by saying that none of these models is perfect, right? But this is an attempt by Geert Hofstede to summarize general tendencies, general differences, broad differences among different cultures that are important for managers to be aware of. It doesn't mean that everyone operating in that culture exactly fits this profile. That's, of course, never true. But I do think it's an interesting general framework that we can apply if we're ever faced with the really exciting challenge of doing business or leading people in other cultures that are different from our own. So we're going to go through 6 of these. I'm going to do a quick video note on each of the 6, but let me lay out what these differences are more generally. So Geert Hofstede came up with several different measures, different spectrums, so to speak, that we can apply to different cultures, and we're going to talk about 6. I'll start with one that is called Individualist Collectivist, and what this means is certain national cultures place more of an emphasis on the individual, right? Personal freedoms, personal responsibility, personal initiative, personal individual goals. That's on the left. While on the right, other national cultures place more of an emphasis on what we call collectivist values. Collectivist means not just myself, but my group, my team, my family, my class, my school. And let's see what these differences actually mean on a practical basis. So a few things. In an individualistic culture, everyone is supposed to take care of himself or herself and our immediate families only, right? We're focused on ourselves. We're focused on people that are very, very close to ourselves. Whereas in a more collectivist culture, people look at themselves as part of a broader group of people, part of a broader family, so to speak. In individualistic cultures, the focus is on me, right? I is a big word in individualistic cultures, whereas in collectivist cultures, the word we tends to be a more prevalent word. Less emphasis on me as the individual, less focus on what I want, more focus on what my class, my group, my team, my organization might want. In individualist cultures, people tend to value privacy, right? Leave me alone, let me do my own thing is something you hear in individualistic cultures. It's none of your business is something you hear a lot in individualistic cultures. Follow your personal goals and dreams is something you hear in individualistic cultures. In collectivist cultures, the stress seems to be more on belonging to a broader group, fitting in, having some sense of harmony across members of a group or a class or a team. Okay, so you can see very big differences so far between individualist cultures and collectivist cultures, but let's look at a few more. Sometimes in individualistic cultures, people are encouraged to express their opinion, right? Let me know what you think. Speak up. Tell me what's on your mind. What do you think about the situation? Those are things that you're likely to hear in individualistic cultures. But if you go to collectivist cultures, sometimes individual opinions are subordinate to what the group thinks. In a collectivist culture, for example, you're less likely to hear people say, tell me what you think individually. Do you agree with the majority opinion? Most of what you find in collectivist cultures tend to be group-based decision-making, group-based thinking, okay? Now, without generalizing too much, and having worked in several cultures myself, I can tell you that there is a pronounced difference in the way people think generally, in the way people behave, in the way people make decisions between individualistic and collectivist cultures. I'll ask you as we go through this, for those of you who live in the United States, do you think the United States is a more individualistic culture or a more collectivist culture? Give that a think. And if you need to pause the video, do that and think about whether we're more individualistic in the US or collectivist and why you think that's the case. And now I'll tell you the answer. So the US is without a doubt considered one of the more individualistic national cultures on the planet. There are plenty of others, but the US is considered one of those individualistic type of countries. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good in all cases. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad in all cases. But most of the world views the US as focusing on I, the individual, focusing on personal goals, taking care of oneself, being independent, speaking your mind, having personal opinions on things and sharing those opinions, even if nobody's particularly interested in those opinions sometimes. On the flip side, one country where I lived and worked for several years is Japan. And Japan is very much viewed as a more collectivist country, a country where the I, or the individual, is not really the center of attention. Instead, the group is the center of attention. You're more likely to hear things in a Japanese office that sound like this. Let's do what's good for the group, even if I have to make personal sacrifices. Or if it's good for the group, then I'll go along and I'll do it. Definitely focused on the group more than the individual. And sometimes that means personal opinions are not always expressed so quickly or so easily. Okay? Now, what are the implications of this? If you grew up, as I did, in a more individualistic culture, and then suddenly you're asked to manage people who happen to be more collectivist, what could that mean for you, and what should you know in advance before you take an assignment like that, for example? Well, one of the ways that you see the implications of this is when it comes to motivation, right? You're learning in this course about how to motivate people. You're learning about expectancy theory. Those of you who've viewed this module already learn about how to use expectancy theory, how to use goal-setting theory to motivate people. The problem is that sometimes what motivates people in individualistic cultures like the US is not what motivates people in collectivist cultures like Japan. I had an experience once where I was trying to motivate one of my employees in Japan, and I made the mistake of telling them that if they did a good job, they would get rewarded with a higher salary. Now, maybe that would have worked in the US, but I was surprised to find out when the employee told me that they would not be motivated if they had a higher salary. They thought that the group goals and the group objectives and other employees in the group getting a higher salary were actually more important than he himself getting a higher salary. So if you're not careful, you might wind up trying to reward people or motivate people using norms and using rewards that might work in your home culture, but might not work very well at all in the target culture, if that target culture is more collectivist, like Japan. Another example where I saw this come to the forefront of my work life is when it comes to problem solving. Sometimes in individualist cultures, people try to solve problems by themselves, or people make decisions by themselves. But sometimes when I needed a difficult decision to be thought about, I needed to, and I was working in a collectivist culture like Japan, I needed to make sure I included a broad number of people across large groups so that their opinions could be taken into consideration. Now, taking people's opinions into consideration is important regardless of where you're doing business. But it was especially important in Japan, where decisions were more valued if they reflected what various people in a group might think. So again, if you're coming from the US, where the focus is on individual decision making, you might want to be conscious if you're working in a culture that requires more group decision making, like Japan. In fact, I won't go into too much detail, but the one sometimes it took quite a while to get decisions made in Japan because so many people in the group needed to go on record as contributing to the decision that sometimes it took maybe double or triple the amount of time to make a decision because so many people in the group needed to be included. And sometimes we needed to record everyone's decision by using this signature system where everybody around the table had to sign that they were okay with the decision before it actually got implemented. Okay, so very, very different implications to decision making in individual versus collectivist cultures. And then the third place where I've seen this happen in my own career is if you grew up in the US as I did, it's pretty typical for people to call out their opinions pretty openly, right? Whether you're talking about a classroom, whether you're talking about a business meeting, we tend to reward individual people for stating their opinion, for having an opinion, for being bold and daring and expressing their opinion. Well, in Japan, traditionally, it's been the opposite. If, for example, you have a strong opinion and just call out your opinion, if you do it the wrong way, you might be considered too arrogant. You might be considered uncooperative. You might be considered disrespectful. So you need to understand that, right? If you happen to be working and managing people in Japan, and maybe you see people being too quiet or not offering their opinion so quickly, it's not because they don't have an opinion, but you might need to ask yourself, is there a better way or is there a better process you can use for learning about their opinion? Maybe instead of expecting them to call out their opinion in a big meeting with 20 people, you might need to approach them privately or individually and create a safe space for them to share their thoughts with you in a way that maybe doesn't jeopardize group harmony as it would in a collectivist culture. Okay, so these are just three quick examples that I've had from my own career of the differences between an individualist national culture and a collectivist national culture. It doesn't mean one is good and one is bad. It just means that if you are leading people across these two different cultural types, there are certain fundamental things you need to understand. Otherwise, you might wind up making a leadership mistake.